Hello everyone, welcome back to AV Chess Lab. In this endgame lesson, we will discuss queen versus pawns, specifically which positions are winning and which are theoretical draws. And we will finish with a couple of exceptions that could potentially give you a win or allow you to save the game. And we're starting right now. So let's first discuss the winning positions. Here, white can only win if the pawn is on the center squares or on the knight squares. The idea is that you want to give checks with the queen. At some point, push this king behind the pawn so that the pawn can no longer promote. So how can we do that? We're just going to give check, the king moves, and every time the king moves away from the pawn, we're just simply going to attack the pawn so that it cannot promote and make sure that the king has to come back and protect it. The king does his job, protects the pawn. Now it gets ready to, if we make some weird move, to simply promote and get a queen, and the game will be a draw. So we again give a check. Now notice that our queen is getting closer and closer to the king and pawn. Again, the king moves. We give another check. King comes back and protects. We give another check. King steps away. And we finally reach a square in which the king has to protect the pawn in this manner. From here, after this check on c3, for example, the king can no longer move away from the pawn because we simply just take it. If the king goes here, we take the pawn. So we manage the position in which the king has to hide behind the pawn. Now the pawn can no longer move forward. And this gives us the opportunity to move our king closer. So every time the king steps behind its own pawn, we're going to bring our king closer. Now from this position, we're going to repeat the same maneuver. But now it's going to happen on the other side. Again, we give the checks, make sure that the king at this point has to hide behind the pawn again. And it is here that we move our king closer. At some point, we're going to repeat this enough that we're going to be able to put our king right next to the queening square. So if we continue, notice that now our king is on e3. So once he steps away, we can simply take the pawn and deliver checkmate. So let's now discuss the positions that will lead to a draw. And this can only occur if we have a rook pawn or bishop pawns. Let's first talk about the rook pawns. So the queen gives a check. And the way to draw this position is to hide behind the pawn. Not as in the previous example, in which the pawns were on the knights and center squares, in which if we put our king behind the pawn, we can bring the other king closer. But notice a big difference here. This queen is actually cutting off all the squares that this king can move to. So if we move this king closer, it will be a stalemate because we cannot actually cross this line of check because the queen is there. So for that reason, the only thing we can do is keep moving the queen closer. But notice at some point, we're going to move our queen to the closest possible square. And still, we can hide behind our pawn and there's nothing that the queen can do. And for this reason, once the king moves closer, this position will be a stalemate and it will be a draw. So let's now examine the situation in which the pawns are on the bishop squares. And that will be the f or c squares, as highlighted by the circles. The mechanism to draw this position is a bit different than the other two examples. In here, we're actually going to allow the queen to capture the pawn, but our king is going to be in a stalemate situation once that happens. So let's see how we can achieve that. So we give a check, and every time they give us a check, we're going to hide in the a1 square. They give us a check again, we come here. And once they give us the check closest to our pawn and king, instead of hiding behind our pawn, we're actually going to go the other way and put our king to the farthest square away as possible. And notice that if this queen captures the pawn, it will be a stalemate situation. And there's no other way to improve this position. If the king gets closer, we simply promote and nothing happens. So this game, the most logical result is just the queen to capture and the game will finish in a draw. So we have already examined the situations in which we can win and in those that it would just lead to a draw. But before we continue to the exceptions, let's review one last time. so that the point sticks. So again, rook pawns and bishop pawns, generally, without the exceptions of course, are drawn positions. The winning positions is if there's a knight pawn or center pawns. The mechanisms of all of these are obviously different, but once you know them, it will be very easy to maneuver and get it done in the game. Now, the exception to these rules are, of course, if your opponent's king is too close to your own king, which will create a mating net once you actually queen your pawn. And for that, I have taken two examples that we're going to look at. In this one here, for example, after the queen check, notice that we highlighted previously that the king wants to hide on the a1 square, so that once you get a queen, the game will be a draw because of stalemate. But we're going to actually make a king maneuver that when you do get your queen, your own king will get checkmated. So for example, king to a1, we give a check on c3, the king comes to b1, and here we play the move king to b3, and we allow black to get a queen. But notice that by getting this queen, the black king has now put itself into a box, and it will get checkmated in a few moves. So we give this check on d3. There's only two possible moves here. You either move the queen to c2, and the game finishes right away, or you move your king to a1. But this will also lead to a loss after queen to a6 check. Again, there's only two moves here. King to b1, which will lead to queen to a2 checkmate, or you sacrifice your queen on a3, after which the game finishes in checkmate anyway. Another beautiful example is the position on the board. Now we have the pawn on the rook square. In this situation, we are again going to allow the pawn to promote into a queen, at the same time putting the king into a box in which it will lead to checkmate. So let's see how that happens. Notice that in order for this to occur, our king needs to be in close proximity so that it can actually get into the square that it needs to get to. So here we give a check, king moves, we give a check, king moves, give another check, and the king has to go back to b1. If it goes back to a1 here, we simply give checkmate on c1. So after king to b1, here comes the move, the king move, that is going to win the game for us. We don't give any more checks. We bring our king closer, and we allow black to promote the pawn into a queen. But notice that, again, after we move the king again to b3, and although material is even, both players have a queen. The player with the black pieces in this situation, the queen cannot give any checks. If check here, we simply capture and we win the game. If check here, we take the queen checkmate. So there are no useful checks. And whenever this queen moves, for example, there, it will be checkmate. So no matter what happens in this position, the white player will be able to checkmate on the next move. Endgames are not easy, and sometimes studying them can be boring, but you do not want to be caught off guard, so take your time to learn these basic concepts. It could be the half-point difference on the scoreboard. Thank you all for watching, keep learning and improving, and as always, stay safe, have a great day, and show respect to your opponent. See you next time.